Coming up on Arirang News, the leaders of South Korea and Malaysia agree to boost their countries' cooperation in high-tech areas such as electric cars and robotics, and to keep working on an FTA. South Korea and Vietnam build closer economic ties with a business forum held in Seoul, signing MOUs in a wide range of industries. And President Trump signs a bill giving American support to the protesters in Hong Kong, infuriating China, which has threatened to retaliate. It's 4:00 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for tuning in to Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. President Moon Jae-in says he looks forward to expanding cooperation with Malaysia in a wide range of areas, extending from the Fourth Industrial Revolution to more concrete areas like defense and healthcare. Here's the president during his summit this morning with the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir bin Mohamad. Take a listen.
말레이시아의 동방정책과 한국의 신남방정책은 조화롭게 접목되어 4차 산업혁명 공동대응, 스마트시티, 할랄 산업처럼 국민들이 체감할 수 있는 협력을 확대하고 있습니다. ICT, 방산, 보건, 중소기업 등 구체적인 분야에서 협력을 더욱 발전시켜 나가길 희망합니다.
During their bilateral talks, President Moon and Prime Minister Mahathir agreed to enhance cooperation on electric cars, robotics, and other high-tech areas based on MOUs signed in March on responding jointly to the Fourth Industrial Revolution. They also acknowledged the importance of their free trade agreement, agreeing to continue efforts to sign a deal soon. President Moon also reaffirmed his determination to establish peace on the Korean peninsula, especially by transforming the demilitarized zone into a global peace zone. Prime Minister Mahathir promised his unchanging support for those efforts. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi will be coming to South Korea next Wednesday. Seoul's foreign ministry said today that Wang will be here for 2 days to meet with South Korea's Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa on issues such as their bilateral relations and the situation on the Korean peninsula. It'll be Wang's first official visit in 5 years. Relations between Seoul and Beijing have worsened in that time over the deployment of the THAAD missile defense system on Korean soil. Eyes are also on whether the two sides will be discussing a possible summit between President Moon and Chinese President Xi Jinping, as well as a potential visit by President Xi to South Korea. An official at the U.S. State Department has brushed off speculation about cracks in the South Korea-U.S. alliance, saying it remains ironclad. The official was quoted Thursday in a report by Voice of America, going on to say that the two countries stand together on the common principles of the rule of law, sovereignty, and human rights, and they share a similar vision of peace and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific region. VOA had asked the U.S. State Department to comment on the possibility of South Korea leaning towards China. The official reportedly said Seoul's military talks with Beijing earlier this month in Thailand do not affect the strong Seoul-Washington alliance. The U.S. Department of Defense has released the estimated cost of maintaining U.S. troops in Korea, nearly $4.5 billion, it says, which may explain the basis for President Trump's reported demands for $5 billion a year. Our Ji-young has more.
The Pentagon says it costs roughly $4.5 billion for the U.S. Army's presence in South Korea, based on the Defense Department estimates for 2020, which were drawn up in March and released on Tuesday local time. According to the estimates, the cost of maintaining military personnel was about $2.1 billion. The cost for operations and maintenance stood at roughly $2.2 billion, and family housing in South Korea cost about $140 million. These, along with other revolving costs for special purposes, brought the total to around $4.46 billion. Sources say this figure suggests why President Donald Trump reportedly asked Seoul to pay $5 billion, or about 5 times more, the previous year for the special measure agreement on cost sharing to maintain a U.S. military presence in South Korea. The U.S. government regularly renegotiates the burden-sharing deal with its allies, and the 2019 agreement required South Korea to contribute $893 million. Sources also say President Trump reportedly threatened to withdraw U.S. troops from its allies if their annual contributions do not meet the demand. However, according to CNN and the Washington Post, the reporting on the $4.5 billion price tag came out of thin air, forcing Department of Defense officials to find justifications for the figure that President Trump is demanding. Sources say as U.S. allies are already making substantial contributions, they are not likely to agree to a sharp rise in costs unless there is a legitimate justification. Ji-young, Arirang News.
The United States plans to provide government funding to address the dire human rights situation in North Korea and to help the North Korean people get access to information. The State Department announced that it will offer funding of up to $3 million to selected organizations. The support is for groups that help outside information get into the North through, for example, radio broadcasts, content that appeals to ordinary North Koreans, or completely new types of media. The U.S. is also looking for projects that record North Korea's human rights abuses through an online database or reports. North Korea's most famous musical group, the Moranbong Band, was going to tour China next month for the first time in 4 years. But Seoul-based Yonhap news agency reports today that the tour has been called off. As for why, the exact reason is unknown, but some think China might have wanted to avoid provoking the U.S. in their trade war. Beijing also seems to have considered the denuclearization talks with the North. The band's tour was going to be in celebration of 70 years of diplomatic relations between Pyongyang and Beijing. On top of that, reports suggest North Korean leader Kim Jong-un will not be going to China before the end of the year, as some thought he might. U.S. President Donald Trump on Wednesday signed into law a bill giving American support to the protesters in Hong Kong, infuriating China. Our Kim Da-mi tells us more.
Despite objections from Beijing, President Trump has decided to back Hong Kong. Trump said in a statement that his decision comes out of respect for President Xi Jinping, China, and the people of Hong Kong, in hopes of leaders of China and Hong Kong settling their differences for peace and prosperity for all. Trump's approval comes just a week after the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives passed the legislation last week. Under the new law, Washington would need to certify at least once a year that Hong Kong retains enough autonomy to qualify for special U.S. trading considerations. The U.S. could also place sanctions on officials responsible for human rights violations in the Chinese-ruled city. The new law also bans exports of certain military supplies, which could be used against the people of Hong Kong. Looking to strike a trade deal with China ahead of the 2020 re-election bid, Trump had been vague about whether he would sign or veto the legislation. However, analysts evaluate that it's highly possible that Trump's latest support for Hong Kong will make it more difficult for the world's two largest economies to reach an agreement. Hinting at possible retaliation against the U.S., China has denounced the legislation as a gross interference in its affairs and a violation of international law. Apart from the two countries' prolonged fight, the Chinese currency may weaken even further, which could also affect the Korean won-US dollar exchange rate. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
The ASEAN-Korea Commemorative Summit has come to a close, but it marks the start of closer business ties between the two. This morning, Seoul hosted the Korea-Vietnam Business Forum. Our business correspondent Kim Hae-sung reports on that forum and some achievements made in the summit with ASEAN.
Korean and Vietnamese business leaders and government officials gathered for a business forum Thursday to strengthen trade and investment ties, signing MOUs in infrastructure development, construction, and autos. Korea is the #1 country investing in Vietnam, and over 5,000 Korean companies have entered the Vietnamese market.
Since the establishment of diplomatic ties in 1992, economic cooperation between Vietnam and Korea has grown rapidly. During my visit to Korea, we have signed agreements, including one to stop firms being taxed twice. We hope to see more Korean companies invest in Vietnam and increase bilateral trade to $100 billion.
Thanks to Vietnam's rapidly growing economy, bilateral trade between Korea and Vietnam has grown 100-fold since 1992. It is now Korea's third largest export market after China and the U.S. Vietnam is not the only country South Korea is expanding economic cooperation with. Over the ASEAN-Korea commemorative summit period, Seoul signed numerous deals with ASEAN countries. Korea struck a comprehensive economic partnership agreement with Indonesia that removes tariffs on steel and autos. Hyundai Motor will also invest $1.5 billion by 2030 to build an auto plant in Indonesia, which will become the firm's first car plant in Southeast Asia when it starts production in 2021. With the Philippines, Korea will continue negotiations on a bilateral free trade agreement, which it aims to finalize by next year. Korea also signed MOUs with Singapore, Brunei, Thailand, and Malaysia in science and technology to enhance cooperation in IT and develop smart cities. Korea and ASEAN countries also agreed to continue efforts to sign the RCEP mega trade deal by 2020. This comes as the Moon administration pushes its new Southern policy aiming to reduce Korea's economic reliance on China and the U.S. and deepen ties with ASEAN, a rapidly growing region with 640 million people and a combined GDP of $2.9 trillion. 김혜성, Arirang News.
Business sentiment among South Korean firms improved slightly this month thanks to increasing sales, but the figure is still far below the benchmark of 100. The Bank of Korea's Business Survey Index for November came to 74 for all industries, edging up 1 point on month. Tech firms, including electronics companies, showed more optimism thanks to an increase in semiconductor sales. The business outlook for December is 73 for all industries, with more manufacturers concerned about sluggish consumption and exports next month. Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined by Mr. Daniel Yu, Global Strategist at Yonhap Securities. Mr. Yu, thank you for making time today.
Thank you very much for having me today.
Well, the Federal Reserve's latest Beige Book is out, and it says the U.S. economy is growing modestly. What else is in the Beige Book, and what do you make of it?
Yes, if you look at the Beige Book comments, the unemployment basically are quite low. The employment continues to rise slightly over even as the labor market remains tight across the United States. Fed says the vast majority of its 12 districts continue to note difficulty in hiring workers. Some contacts noted their inability to fill jobs was constraining the business growth. The wage pressures are rising slightly in a modest pace during the reporting period. The retailers and manufacturers are in some districts mentioned higher cost, which some attributed to the tariffs issues. Most of the districts reported a stable, moderate growth, growing consumer spending, and increases in the auto sales and tourism were seen across the several districts. Overall, basically, the U.S. economy seems to be fairly stable, and the growth rate remains to be well above 2%. We think that this trend can continue in the future, and because of this, the overall market seems to be moving nicely in the right track.
Well, so with U.S. growth picking back up in the third and fourth quarters and some optimism on a trade deal with China, stocks on Wall Street have set new records for a fourth day in a row now. What's the story there?
Yes, as you said, the record high indices are continuing to happen in here. If you look at the U.S. growth rate, it is at 2.1% for GDP growth rate. And in terms of the consumer spending-wise, it is rising by 0.3% month on month. It is higher than expected. And the overall, the wage increases are rising at around 4.89% YOY. All this is indicating that the overall economy is very, very stable. Having said that, if you look at the equity market, Dow, the S&P, and the NASDAQ continues to show rising trend. Yes, there's some indication that overheating is happening, but nevertheless, valuation seems to remain quite attractive. We think that the additional rise can happen till the year end, so we might see the center rally or the year-end rally.
Well, tomorrow we have the Bank of Korea releasing or having its last meeting of the year to set interest rates, and the outlook seems to be almost certain that rates will stay where they are. What's the feeling among investors, and how are Korean stocks doing?
Well, Korean stocks are not doing too well. You can see that foreign investors continue to net seller of Korean equity market, and the growth rate of Korea seems to be much below the intrinsic growth rate. So if you're looking at the growth rate next year, in order to meet well above 2%, we think that they need to cut additional rate. So they're not going to cut it tomorrow probably, but over the next course of 6 to 12 months, we think that the BOK will cut probably another 25 basis points in order to boost the economy. Not just the monetary policies, but the fiscal policy needs to be effective as well. We need to see the supplementary budget or next year's budget needs to grow in a quite sizable amount to see the overall economy to grow. So without those, we think that Kospi will continue to be underperformer to relative to global equity market. As of today, Kospi was also down. Kosdaq was down quite sizably. And this was affected by the renminbi depreciation as well as Korean won depreciations due to the signing of the bill by U.S.
Got it. All right, Mr. Yu, that's where we'll have to leave it for today. Great to get your insights as always.
Thank you very much.
Now, as Korea and the ASEAN countries forge closer ties, experts at the World Bank are also optimistic. They told Arirang News that Seoul has many examples to offer in trade, investment, and building human capital that could be of great benefit to the ASEAN countries. Oh Soo-young has more.
South Korea's miracle on the Han River could also change the course of the Mekong River economies. That's according to economists at the World Bank who spoke to Arirang News. With Korea and the 10 nations of ASEAN striking up closer economic ties this week, the World Bank also sees large potential for shared development and prosperity amid global uncertainties and trade disputes.
I think other countries look to Korea in terms of its development model, in terms of how it was able to, leverage trade and investments to drive growth. You have to have a government that is competent, is able to recognize good policy and regulations to promote private sector development.
Trade between Korea and ASEAN countries grew 20-fold over the last 3 decades, while investment grew 70-fold. Investment by Korean firms such as POSCO in Indonesia are helping turn local industries in Vietnam and Indonesia into regional powerhouses.
It's very interesting, a company like Samsung's investments in Vietnam are not just allocating tasks to the Vietnamese, but encouraging them to move up the value chain and do progressively more and more innovative activities. I think South Korea is a paragon of successful development, one of the countries which moved not just out of low income but to middle income. But in our report we say they're at the cutting edge. They're doing increasingly innovative goods and services are being produced in the country, and it is reaching out to other countries.
Another noteworthy aspect of Korea's development experience is its commitment to nurturing a skilled labor force.
The World Bank has a human capital index that we published last year, I believe, and Korea was ranked number 2. So this is an indication of how Korea, I think, was very successful in, early on, recognizing the importance of investing in its people to be able to, for instance, adopt technologies, and later on also to generate new technologies.
However, both South Korea and ASEAN countries face challenges to growth as the wave of automation and new technology disrupts traditional industries and jobs. The expert said new policies are urgently needed to encourage innovative ventures and train future workers in relevant skill sets. South Korea and ASEAN's joint vision declared this week pledges to tackle global challenges together, joining hands in trade, investment, education and entrepreneurship. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
The Federal Reserve says the U.S. economy is growing modestly, and on Wednesday, the Commerce Department also raised its growth estimate for the third quarter. Yoon Jung-min reports.
The U.S. Federal Reserve says the U.S. local economy has expanded modestly from October to mid-November with a positive outlook for growth and a solid labor market. In its latest Beige Book report, the Fed said the outlook generally remained positive with the current pace of growth expected to continue next year. Despite a rather mixed bag for the manufacturing sector, the bank said the job market remained stable overall, citing relatively strong job gains in professional and technical services as well as in healthcare. It said, however, the ongoing trade spat between the U.S. and China has dragged down the growth, affecting manufacturers and business investment.
The U.S. has been maintaining modest growth, which lessens concerns over a global recession. That's also good news for South Korea, which is highly dependent on global economic conditions.
On Wednesday, the U.S. Commerce Department revised upward the U.S. third quarter growth to 2.1% from the previous forecast of 1.9%. The revised GDP growth reflected more inventory accumulation and a less steep decline in business investment than expected. Consumer spending, which accounts for more than two-thirds of U.S. economic activity, showed some moderate growth. On the back of improved economic figures and high hopes for a U.S.-China trade deal, U.S. stocks continue to hit record highs. On Wednesday, the Dow Jones Industrial Average was up 0.15%. The S&P 500 rose around 0.4%, while the Nasdaq went up more than 0.6%. Amid rising stocks, analysts, however, also warned against having too much high expectations for the Washington-Beijing trade deal. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
It's the time of the year when you see the Salvation Army on the streets raising money for those in need. This year, the Salvation Army here in Korea is promoting the spirit of giving in a smarter way. Lee Kyung-eun has this story.
The red, iconic Salvation Army pod has become a symbol of the season, with many people knowing the feeling of taking money out of their pocket and dropping it in the pod on a cold winter day. But this year in central Seoul, the pods are a little bit different.
The Salvation Army Korea territory has introduced the so-called Smart Charity Pod and allows you to make a donation by just one touch of your card.
Installing the Smart Pod for the first time in Seoul Plaza on Wednesday, the Salvation Army said it is adopting the charity culture to suit people's changing lifestyles.
It will help reach people who are more used to cards and online payments than cash. We are first distributing 100 pots across the city this year, but plan to spread them across the whole nation by next year.
The new device also takes transportation cards or online payment systems like ZeroPay or NaverPay. It is a collaboration between the Korean Salvation Army and the local branch of German cookware company Fissler, which has been providing and repairing the pots since 2004. Lately, they've been working together to transform the traditional charity campaign into a more fun and interactive activity. And this year, their new high-tech pod not only makes the donation process convenient, but also more interesting.
I've always participated in the campaign with cash, so first of all, it feels very new, and it also makes donations more fun.
Also for this year, the Salvation Army has introduced the Hope Train, which will offer warm shelter for citizens while sending people the message that the spirit of giving will keep moving forward. Located in one of the busiest areas in the city, the Salvation Army's new project will give people a chance to think about their neighbors in need and what they can do to help. Lee Kyung-eun, Arirang News.
And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.